there have been several newspaper accounts, major stories, large stories, particularly in the Saturday and Sunday's Democratic Chronicle about items we've already talked about. They revisited some prison problems, and there have been one or two articles on post-traumatic treatment, and they use the term PTSD of veterans. We could have used them, but I don't like to go back and jump in the middle of something that we've already discussed, but very relevant in terms of this type of thing. Yes.
Something I wanted to share about that. I went to the SAFE organization, the students. It's like the interfaith organization. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So they had like an interfaith banquet on Saturday, and the speaker, I forget her name, but she was. Were you there? Okay. Okay. So she's been a community organizer in Chicago for the past 20 or so years, and she's a really big advocate for prison abolition. And so she kind of she touched on a lot of the same subjects that we've kind of touched on, and the greater issues of the structural racism behind it. It was just really interesting, kind of in light of everything that we've talked about recently.
Did you speak with her personally by any chance?
Not at the end. She kind of had to rush off before. It was like a 2-hour-long talk, and she shared a lot of different personal stories and experiences with the mostly like younger men that she's worked with, kind of to get in the transition out of prison, and just a lot of the like idea of how to organize around that. So it was very interesting.
Now, is she talking about basically being here, organizing the campus, or organizing it at your various communities?
She kind of touched on, well, for her it's more, she's still based in Chicago, and so doing a lot of that. Some of the questions that people asked in the Q&A at the end were kind of how could we as students approach this issue? And a lot of what she said was just with like the interpersonal connections that we have with people, just trying to, like we can have the most impact on the people that we're close to. So just talking to the people around us, before you try to go out and convince the whole other group of people. And she kind of touched on a lot of the, some of the hot topics. Like a lot of people, go and try to argue against the death penalty or try to argue about this, and she's just kind of taking a wider stance against the prison system overall. And a lot of what we said about how it doesn't repair people, it's just holding them there. And it's really interesting.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
About 2 hours?
Yeah.
Very good. Well, why don't we get started with who we have? And I wanted to talk about immigration, since that's probably next to the major topic in the country today, but also to begin talk on I think there have been two major internal migrations. The Great Migration that we'll begin looking at today. And there's one that doesn't get that much coverage, but it's the migration of very poor white people from the Southwest to California. If you saw the movie, if anyone saw it, and they always show it, it's never been remade, but it was from around 1940. But every now and then, at least once a year, you'll see it on television, the whole movie. Tobacco Road or Grapes of Wrath, both of them portend to the same thing. But large number, thousands of very poor white people left, and it was called they were the Dust Bowl people. And that was only because the land had been parched. Unusual famine in the United States in the mid-1930s, and the specter of it added to the depression of the Great Depression that started in this country till 1930 and lasted for most of that decade. It kind of eroded slowly after Franklin Roosevelt became president, but there was a lot of things that happened between his presidency in 1932 until 1940, and much of it surrounding the plight of poor white people who packed up all they had and moved everybody to California. A few went to Washington State. I don't know if any who went to Oregon, I'm sure they were, but the majority went to California because in California it was unhit by the famine, and it was a great place for grape growing, those kind of orchards for apples and for fruits. Thus we have the Grapes of Wrath as a title of one of Steinbeck's books. Steinbeck, I think, wrote both books, Grapes of Wrath and Tobacco Road, both made into very memorable films. I doubt if they'll remake those simply because they were so impactful at the time that they were done, and I think people may not be able to relate to them now. They could relate to them awfully well in 1940. But nonetheless, we want to look at immigration as a whole and bring it down to the internal immigration that we're talking about. Now, the United States of America has been mandated by its executive office to enact new national rules and regulations restricting and in some cases terminating the entry of immigrants, refugees, strangers, Muslims, or foreigners from seeking settlement in this country. Now, taken to another level, all places of habitat, including cities, towns, and religious institutions, can no longer be called places of sanctuary or asylum. Up until now, if a fugitive was running, just say from the police, and found the church door open or any religious door open, a synagogue, a temple, a mosque, they could run in and the police could not come in. They would have to wait that person out because religious institutions are always considered to be places of sanctuary. So this attempts to obviate it, yet there is, and I know you might not have really looked at this very closely, but there is a secular constitutional law that seeks to separate both church and state. So this is a matter in which the state cannot encroach upon, but the current executive office is attempting to do that. Now, living in this country as Americans, most all of us have a genealogical point of origin, our ancestors, our great-great ancestors. Most of us go back 3 and 4 generations. But we have a genealogical point of origin that is not this country. This causes those new laws, these acts, to become rather draconian and against the human rationality given to us by God. This makes it clear that religious institutions, academic institutions, or any institution that impacts society with a moral purpose cannot just stand by and let any act of human oppression be obeyed without a struggle. And I think that's what came across in your meeting on Saturday. Yes.
Well, I just had a question about the sanctuary cities. Maybe I thought it was, maybe this is, more specific than what you were getting at, or I understood it wrong, but I thought it was that any place that gets federal funding, they can't declare themselves to be a sanctuary city.
Well, yeah, because the threat is that if they don't desist, they'll pull the money.
So, but then, obviously that makes it much more difficult for cities and towns, but couldn't religious institutions still?
Yes, that does not apply to religious institutions.
Okay,
And that's
yeah.
what I was talking about.
Okay.
Yes, but that's holding really a heavy hammer over let's say, the mayors of cities.
Yeah.
It's always comes out of the mayor's office, what we call City Hall. These things know we're a sanctuary city, we have a tradition of being a sanctuary city, and we're going to remain a sanctuary city, no matter what the new law might say. And I'm pleased that we have a number of mayors who have taken that position. But that's a heavy dictum that they're operating under, and it's going to be interesting, including this city, to see how that goes. But thank you for raising it. Now, what is the response then of all of these institutions that we have talked about to this position, if we indeed think it to be rather flagrant? And the whole question remains, and it's probably not the way this class should go, but because you're young adults and you're going to be facing these issues, I'm going to put it to you, do we just capitulate out of fear? Do we say, I don't believe it, but if this is the rule, then we're going to accept it? That's a good question. If we realize that America is a nation of immigrants, they all came to this land for centuries, seeking a resurrection of their own lives, with the exception of two groups of people: red people, commonly known as Indians, and the African. These two groups were not, but all of the others came here voluntarily. Red people were already here, and even though America was named as such by Europeans, the country in reality belongs to them. The few who are left. Someone referred to the Indian nations in this country nearly 100 years ago as the vanishing Americans. You'll find that Indians have very few children. They have one or two, that's about it. So they do not procreate well, and they don't have the same vein structure, I guess that might be correct, as most people, vein arteries and hookups. And they definitely cannot partake of some things such as people who are not Indian can partake of. And as you put that cup down, I'm thinking primarily of alcohol. When I was in the Army, we had a few Indian guys with us, but there was a rule, there was a law, a military law, that the PX could not post-exchange. The PX could not sell any intoxicating beverage, including beer, to Indian soldiers, because after one beer, they're intoxicated. And why that is, I don't know. A lot of people say it's part of the venal structure, all kind of things. But if you see these movies, these old Western movies about these crooked Indian agents trying to sell guns and stuff to the end, they'll get them drunk first. And, but nonetheless, it is true that red people, as I call them, cannot handle some of the things that other people can very well. In terms of Africans, they were kidnapped and they were forced here in chains to serve as the major conduits of capitalism and economic determinism through the system of human slavery. America tries to forget that, but they can't. Every time they see a black face, they're reminded how we got here. Now, from the 17th century until the present. Hi.
Hi.
Here, paper. Good to see you. See, I told you she'd show up today, Ms. Martin. I told you.
I told you.
Now, let's continue. We're talking about immigration, for those of us who will get it. Now, from the 17th century until the present time, the land called America was peopled by those from England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, the Ukraine, Scandinavia, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and for a brief while from Asia, England and Ireland and Scotland, France, Germany, and Italy, Lithuania, the Ukraine and Scandinavia, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, several other European lands, and for a brief while from Asia. They all came either fleeing political repression, natural vegetative disasters such as the huge potato famine in Ireland in the late 1840s, religious persecution. They came as indentures on contract for military utilization, such as the French during the Revolutionary War, or they came fleeing any form of persecution, but all came voluntarily and generally were welcomed as immigrants, with many of them bringing what? Skills and other talents of artisan capabilities. I can't apologize if we have any Jewish students in our class, because this is history. Jews, however, were disliked, and especially following the political implications of the Dreyfus affair in France, and that saw international anti-Semitism soar out of proportion. But many Jews were still to find refuge in America. Up to the time of World War I, let's say circa 1915, European refugees found sanctuary in the United States by the millions. Immigration into America can be gauged in three periods. We look at three major periods in American history which frame immigration. 1820 to 1900, 1820 to 1900, that's the first period. 1901 to 1940, 1901 to 1940. And 1941 to 1990, 1941 to 1990. Mostly benefiting Europeans. Since the 1960s, 50 years ago, the brunt of refugees would come from Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Thailand, and Vietnam. Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Thailand, and Vietnam. You can throw Cambodia in there too, but not as many Cambodians as the other Southeast countries. Only a small number of Japanese and Chinese would immigrate, with many of them coming into the country on student visas. But from 1980 to 1988, which we call the Reagan era, large numbers of Cubans would come under the name of, quote, political refugees, though during that same period, Haitian boat people were denied entry into the United States. And that has never been clarified as to why. Most of us know. But there's been no governmental explanation other than the fact that they were not considered political refugees. Though Haiti, during the presidency of both Francois Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude Duvalier, were extremely repressive, executed a lot of people, and forced out of the country all Europeans, include French churchmen and nuns. President Duvalier, the father, Francois Duvalier, note the French name, had insisted that all Catholic European missionaries and all European priests and all European nuns of the Catholic Church go back. They will not be allowed to stay. If they stayed, they would be imprisoned. And he placed Haitian priests and Haitian nuns and Haitian religious authorities in place, black people. And persecution was very, very high. And yet, they were not permitted to come into the country. Now, from 1882, with the congressional passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of that year, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, until 1943, that's a long time, 1882 to 1943, Chinese were effectively banned. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was drafted by Congress as a means to terminate the bringing in, on the West Coast, Chinese laborers to build railroads, with the fear that the growing Chinese population was getting so high, as well as the Japanese population getting so high, that it would pose a threat to democratic values. So the media joined into this tragedy by relating the Chinese, most particularly the Chinese, to a lesser extent, the Japanese presence in America toward the end of the 19th century as the, quote, Yellow Peril, P-E-R-I-L. I said it would last until 1943 because at the outset of World War II, China was considered an ally of the United States, and American mercenary pilots would volunteer for combat duty in China. And one of the most, well, from my standpoint, where I was sitting as a young boy, one of the most beautiful women in the world, physically, was Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She came to this country many times during the war, was a great friend of President Roosevelt. Later, after his death, became a great friend of President Truman, getting aid for the Chinese. So by 1943, China was back on the approved list of immigrants, although that didn't really burgeon at all, but nonetheless, the ban was rooted out. And since 1882, there have been 32 immigration acts up to 1990. That is, acts through Congress, 32 immigration acts up to 1990. And prior to 1960, most of them were framed with respect to limiting the immigrant movement of non-Europeans. Now, there were exceptions at times. Concerning the ability of some groups coming into the country, Europeans. There are more Germans, people of German extraction in the United States since the 20th century. There are more Germans than any other group of European nationals. But Germans were heavily restricted from coming into this country from 1916 to 1920 because of the fact that they were the chief opponents of America and of Great Britain and of France during World War I.
Excuse me, would you mind saying when it ended?
Hmm?
You said 1960 until when?
1920. The war ended itself in 1918.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That is the American involvement. The American involvement was barely 2 years. They were late getting into the fray because of President Woodrow Wilson, who was a little reluctant to move from the position of isolationism. That will also become a fact during World War II when you have Wendell Willkie, Lindbergh, the hero of the individual flight across the Atlantic, and President Roosevelt. They never did get together on that issue. Even Rick, you know who Eddie Rickenbacker, you've heard of him? He was the primary World War I flying ace, those double wing planes, is he making all that noise? Well, he was the primary American ace. He shot down more German planes than anybody. He would live a long time, and he would become very pronounced on this whole issue of isolationism, along with Charles Lindbergh and President Roosevelt. That formed a triad of different political opinions. Should America get involved in World War II? Should America help the British during World War II? Should this happen? Should that happen? Some were saying America should stay out of it. Wendell Willkie, who would run for president of the United States in 1940, was a very formidable isolationist. President Roosevelt kind of hedged because he really loved Winston Churchill. They were great friends, and he passed the Lend-Lease bill, which meant that America would produce weapons of mass destruction, tanks, airplanes, weapons, and lend them to Great Britain. That's where the term Lend-Lease comes from, but without becoming physically involved in the war. This would create a major concern, and it became a political issue because it became a population issue. So America was moving towards some division, certainly a lot
Cancer Center,
of discussion.
Response Cancer Center, 6-4. Response Cancer Center, 6-4.
I wish you'd get a job with the New York Yankees. It became a population issue until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Then everybody became a patriot overnight and demanded that the country be militarized. But that's not for this class. That's now, in the Germans from 1916 to 1920 were restricted, obviously. And again, Germany from 1940 to 1947. So even though we have a tremendous level yet today of German ancestry, those two periods, 4 years or 5, 16 to 20, and 40 to 47, basically 8 years, German immigration was stymied. Now, Italian immigration was also slowed down between 1941 and 1944 because of its war with Ethiopia, and later its alliance with Nazi Germany. But nothing was to match the dehumanizing of the United States against European Jews seeking asylum in America from the horrors of the Nazi Germany Holocaust. Beginning in 1939, Jews were not permitted settlement in America until 1945. One of the most shameful incidents in United States history occurred in 1939 when a transport ship, a French transport ship, the St. Louis, was denied entry into U.S. ports because it had roughly 2,000 or more Jewish people on board who had left France attempting to escape the German Nazi regime. Now, including, I said 2,000 plus Jews are on this ship. That included women and children. For nearly a month, that ship stood by itself in the waters off of the coast of the United States, seeking a place where Jewish refugees could come. President Roosevelt hedged, he hedged, but he was surrounded by a very difficult cabinet, most of them Southern Democrats, who kept whispering in his ear, don't let them in, don't let them in, they're Jews. So he finally capitulated, and he ordered them not to be let off that ship. So they turned around. They couldn't gain entry into Canada. They had to go all the way back to France, where everybody on that ship was arrested by the Nazis and forced into prison camps where the majority, including children, died. They were killed by the Germans. And that's a terrible, terrible history that this country cannot live down. Yes?
I was just going to say just like a personal story about that. So my family's Jewish, and we,
Oh.
yeah. My grandfather, so they're all from Germany originally. And they left kind of, like my grandfather and his parents left right before the war, but they couldn't, like you kind of said, they couldn't get into the U.S. So then they got to Bolivia, and they got visas there, and they lived there for about like 5 or 6 years, and eventually they got into the U.S. But they were like the one, you know, besides from him and his parents, like the rest of his family couldn't get out, so it was kind of, they were the ones to escape.
Yes, now they did, a number of them did go to Argentina periodically, but that became a very difficult place for them because the Nazis escaping the American or the Allied invasion, once they knew that the jig was up for the Nazis, a lot of Nazi officials were when you stole away, when they were given passage to Argentina, where many of them lived out their lives. Although there was a group of Jewish guys who created a organization that sought to find Nazis who were living in hiding, and they were very successful. Several of the men that they caught, including Adolf Eichmann, were living in South America, so they got them. And they brought them back, and they were tried, and they were found guilty, and most of them were executed, including Eichmann, who played a major role in the killing of Jewish people in the death camps that you can run, like Joe Louis, the champion of the world, said, you can run, but you can't hide. Yeah, that's true. Now, interestingly, from the St. Louis, always contradicting much of what President Roosevelt was attempting to do was his wife, Eleanor, who was one of the, I give her all kind of gold stars. In my opinion, she was the second greatest woman, American woman of the 20th century. But she argued. Whatever positive stance Roosevelt would take on the racial issue, it was because of Eleanor Roosevelt. But what she did, after this ship was sent back, she organized a program for Jewish children to be brought into this country, to be adopted, or I guess adopted.
Systems test. Systems test.
You just used it.
We just gotta make sure.
He's saying we are being tapped. That's what he said. That's what it sounds like. It got off to a slow start, but these were children, they were called refugee children, and she couldn't put the name Jewish on them, so they had to agree to put the name European. This gave the children a better opportunity of coming. I think they came from England or somewhere, but they were all children of Jewish families that had been placed in concentration camps. Still very, very sad history. Now, interestingly though, from 1900 to 1930, there was a black immigrant inclusion. 100,000 blacks came into the country from colonial Caribbean, with the largest number coming from British Jamaica. Now, among the approximate Afro-Caribbeans, many were intellectuals, writers, poets, and craftsmen, many of whom would become outstanding during that period known as the Harlem Renaissance from 1920 until 1930. And of course there are thousands and thousands of those Caribbean descendants in America today. The greater proportion of them settled in New York City and the Harlem section of New York City. Now, we should note that both Hawaii and the Philippines before 1930, had at least 50,000 people to settle in America. And like those from Asia, they had very limited civic and political rights. Now, for the big number, between 1820 and 1990, what's that, 170 years? Between 1820, that's when immigration was first legally documented, 1820, and 1990, 60 million immigrants came to America. 60 million. Now this number does not take into account the millions who came as illegal entrants, later as undocumented labor, those who were sneaked into the country for illegal labor practices, poverty-ridden illegal entrants, who later would be called undocumented. And what was the group of Mexicans who came, they were called wetbacks. A wetback is a derisive term, but had, this wall that the current president is talking about building, they would cross the Rio Grande at night. And the Rio Grande is very shallow. I was stationed in El Paso, Texas when I was in the Army, and I was looking for Rio Grande means big river. In Spanish, I was looking for, like a tsunami, all kind of, little tricket. I'm going to eat fish in there. We can walk across Rio Grande River. A lot of the Mexican people, that's how they got into this country, just by crossing the Rio Grande at night. There were no gates, no fences, nothing. And they were called wetbacks because of treading through the water to get here. One of the undesirable things that happened to me when I was in the military, we had bivouac out in the desert. That's night problems, where they construct actual combat situations for us to train in. But one day, our commanding officer came to us and said, we have been asked, because of the number of, he used the term, wetbacks that are coming to this country, we have been asked to form a perimeter in that desert, and any people we find who are illegal Mexicans, we have to hold until they're arrested. I didn't find any. I saw about 3 of them. I didn't say anything. I let them go ahead. Poor guys, they look hungry. I said, if they get caught, I'm not going to catch them. But one of our guys did. He caught about 2 of them. And those are only 5 that I remember seeing. He caught 2. I let 3 go by. I could have caught them. Sure, I had a weapon. I loaded. I could have, but I didn't. I just let them go. Something just came over me. I wasn't right. I wasn't a righteous person. I wasn't a moral person, but there's something about that was just wrong to me. So I just let it go. I said, I'm not going to tell. I wish them the best. It was nighttime. And sometimes the guys would shoot at rabbits. They'd be so scared a rabbit would run around. But no, I didn't do that. But that was something that happened. And what happened for years and years and years. I've forgotten who he is, but he might be dead now, but he was a very famous Spanish movie actor from Mexico who came to this country like that. And he ended up in California and went to school, high school, and I think he's got into arts that way, and he was recruited to come to Hollywood, and he did. He made it. He was, I think, Anthony Quinn. Anthony Quinn? Anybody ever heard Anthony Quinn? Hey, when were y'all born? Good grief. Anthony Quinn died about, 5 or 6 years ago, but he was a great actor. He was a character actor. He played, his last role was as a Don in the Mafia. I forgot the name of the movie, but it's within the last 10 years. It was way after The Godfather. But he was very good. He was a great actor. Anthony Quinn. His movies are still extant, I believe. But at any rate, a large number of people did get to this country by that means. If you made it, if you escaped, and if you could get another identity, fine, you would never get caught. Now, the descendants from them all in the year 2017 populate all of the United States. Now, I'm going to talk about Jews again. The Jewish groups from war-drenched Eastern and Southern Europe since 1945 have been more openly received, chiefly due to the public revelations of German death camps and the horror of 6.5 million Jews who lost their lives. I think that number is maybe a little higher, I'm not sure. I do a lot of individual by myself research, and the Holocaust has always been of interest to me because of the relationship of Jews and black people in this country. I think the Holocaust number should be around 7 million, simply because the Holocaust figures has never taken into account the 125,000 Jewish children who were killed. Can you imagine that now? If you had a little baby, a little girl, a little boy, if you had you were a big brother, big sister, and they separated your family, you were to learn that your siblings had been gassed. Terrible. Now, if you see the movie The Diary of Anne Frank, you believe it because that happened. Sad history. But you know, we rebel at it now because simply it was wrong. It was immoral. And it was devastating to a large number of people. But the inclusion of Jews since 1945 have as well brought to America an incredible array of talented people. Jewish doctors, scientists, filmmakers, actors, composers, playwrights, conductors, devotees of human justice. Yet many immigrant Jews were hunted and harassed in the 1950s by Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, whose anti-Semitism was far beyond the American ideal of freedom, justice, equality, and peace for all people. Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein, you have studied them? What, you have? Thank you. Well, they were already well known before they came. They were Jews, but they had to come because of the Nazis. And Einstein especially, I think it was at Princeton, was probably the most imitated scientist in the history of this country because of his theory of relativity, that he formulated. But he was really a brilliant guy. Disheveled, clothes never fit him. He never combed his hair. He looked just like a mad professor, which he was, but he was a very smart man. But Albert Einstein also was a co-chair in the 1930s of an anti-European colonialism in India and in Africa. He co-chaired it with Ho Chi Minh, French Indochina. That was a short-lived liberation organization, but very prominent in terms of what they were able to do over a short period of time. And it's a wonder that Einstein was welcomed as he was, having that already on his resume, but he was. And lived quietly. Freud didn't live quietly, but he did. Einstein did. While here, Freud, I never did like Freud. I never did care for his, none of his stuff, that ego and all that, alter ego and all that stuff. Nah. That's just the devil sitting on one shoulder and the angel on the other. And the devil says, do it. And the angel says, don't you dare do it. And that is an angel. That's all you have to do. And forget the id, all that other stuff. But my favorite European psychologist was Carl Jung. I really gravitated toward Carl Jung. His theory of ancestral restorationism, I really loved that. And I just read a lot of Carl Jung when I was in college. Really was fascinated by his theories. Did I see a hand?
Oh no, I was just agreeing.
All right, you like Carl Jung?
Yeah.
All right. You got Jungian. You're a Jungian.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We're in the minority, you know. All right. Now, before we leave this part, we had two Jews, husband and wife. Their names, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were executed in 1953 for complicity with the Russian government, as both were American scientists. They were accused of giving vital information to the Russians with respect to the United States. And they were tried and they were found guilty. They had 2 small children and they were executed. My theory on that, and I followed that case, I was in the Army when that broke, and I followed it. My theory was that they were killed, they were executed, not because they were spies. That was a period of McCarthyism, and that was a period when a whole lot of people were arrested as spies. None of them were executed, but Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were killed because they were Jews. Nobody came to the fore to protest that killing. No churchmen, no one from synagogues, no one anywhere. Politicians, nobody. They came, they lived, they worked, they were arrested, they were tried, they were killed. And that was it. The book closed on Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But you had some people from that period who did far more. Men such as Whittaker Chambers, white man. You had others who would go to prison and stay 2-3 years. You had German Nazi scientists who put together that V1 and V2 bomb that dropped on London, England, and killed thousands of people, were brought to the United States to work. They sent him down to Tennessee, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Von Braun. And he worked down there for years and years and years. And in Tennessee, black people had no civic rights. And this guy killed thousands of people. And he could go anywhere that he wanted to. Big salary. Died in the United States. Where is the justice? Where is it? Now, we cannot get away with that stuff. Y'all not going to let it happen, are you? No. No, you're not. You're going to speak up. Because that's what was not happening in the 1930s and the 1940s, the 1950s. Righteous people remained silent. Somebody once said, some historical person once said, evil exists in our world because good people do nothing. That's right. If it's wrong, condemn it. Don't let it go. Now, I'm going to close this part. Now, from 1885 until the second decade of the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church in America was relentlessly attacked with Polish, Irish, and especially Italian refugees targeted for violence and for killing. It was hard being Italian in those days. That 20-year period was extremely difficult, from 1890 to 1910, because over that 10-year period, or that 20-year period, over 20 Italians, immigrants, were murdered by white mobs. Italians were accused of being criminals, spies, social non-achievers, but all Catholic refugees were labeled as papists, that is, followers of the Pope, and subject to another authority, that is, the Vatican, as over against the Constitution. And that's what John Kennedy had to really struggle through in terms of defining why he wanted to become the first Catholic to run for the office of the presidency of the United States.
I just think it's interesting that, so in current times, like Italians are just like classified as white people, but then in your previous statement, you're like Italians were killed by white mobs, and so
Yes.
like, the term white, like obviously, like it has some parts to do with skin tone, but also white is an identifier for like the social majority, like the social like hierarchy.
Yes.
And so Italians weren't really classified as white in the time when they weren't popular, and then as soon as everything was okay, like they are counted as white now.
Yeah, and the same thing with Jewish people. In fact, when we grew up with, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and we had a scattering of Jewish people, but we would say, well, Jews aren't white, you know, or we'd say, he's not white, he's a Jew, because of the fact that Jewish people were isolated like we were, not given much of an opportunity to spread their wings. But most Jewish businesses were in the black community, and they were very favorable in hiring black people. I'll get right to you. One incident I'll share with you. When I was growing up, I lived on Miami Avenue in Columbus, and up about a block ahead of us was Mount Vernon Avenue, which was what they call the main drag for black people. Most black businesses were on Mount Vernon. That was a social scene. But also a lot of Jewish merchants were there. And this one Jewish merchant had a very large department store. They sold furniture. As a matter of fact, it was first floor, second floor, called Spicer's. And Mr. Spicer was the owner. And his office was on Mount Vernon Avenue in the building. Mr. Spicer was an older man, somewhat rotund, but always with a cigar hanging out of his mouth, and he had fleshy red cheeks. But everybody endearingly in the black community called him Old Man Spicer. But everybody just idolized him. He had done this for black people. Instead of, because most of us didn't have cars, I'm talking about our parents, and you had to pay your gas and electric bill downtown. So he worked it out so that black people or whoever wanted to could come to Spicer's and pay their gas bill and their telephone bill there. And that was very convenient. So my mother used to send me with the money to pay the gas bill and or the telephone bill at Spicer's. And always there were long lines, just like you go to a bank, but there were some lines where you had to wait your turn. And I got up right next to the table where Mr. Spicer and a white man were sitting, and the white man was obviously some kind of a distributor or something, because he had these pictures of everything, so he's trying to influence, I guess, Mr. Spicer to buy certain furnitures for his store. I heard this white guy ask him, he said, why are so many black people, why do you have so many Negroes, he said, why do you have so many Negroes working in here? Because you had the black people on the counter, the floor walker, Mr. Mackey, was a black man. I went to school with his two sons. His son, Ernie, was the first black quarterback in high school. So Mr. Spicer, you could see him get angry, and he turned to this guy and he said, I'm going to have to swear, y'all. May I say a bad word?
Mm-hmm.
All right. He said, because they're the last hired and the first fired, damn it. And this guy turned red as a beet, and I turned around and you had other older black people in line with him, they just smiled, because that's the best thing they could do. They just looked at each other and just smiled. But that's how he was. He was a tough old man. Yeah, we had them. And by virtue of the fact that we did not think that they were white, just like you said, they were just, what do you call them? They're not white, they're Jews. Or they're not white, they're Italians. Because a lot of the Italians look dark anyway, But we'll find out there's a difference between Italy and Sicily. That means they're broken off a little bit. Sicilian's down below. And a Sicilian does not like to be called an Italian, but that's what they are. That's what a Sicilian told me. I said, as an Italian, you come to, oh, I'm from Sicily. I said, oh, all right. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think another thing maybe that, like.
Now, you're going to have to talk louder because you talk so low.
I was gonna say, something else that the Jewish community and the Black community kind of have in common that I think is a source of, I think it's common ground.
Yeah.
And probably was historically, is that they were both, like, segregated and sort of, like, you know, the first ghettos were.
Stroke team, call the emergency department, critical care bay.
You know,
Stroke team, call the emergency department, critical care bay.
like, they were forced into those settlements
Mhm.
in.
But
in
that's what
Europe
they're
and in
called in
Russia.
Europe. They were
Yeah.
actually called ghettos.
Yeah, that's, and then when they came to America, I mean, my great-grandparents, came here in the early they came before World War I, I think,
Mhm.
yeah. And they came to escape the pogroms in Eastern Europe.
Where were they from?
They were from, I guess it would, back then it was like, it was the Russian Empire, but today it would be Ukraine.
You're Russian immigrants.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, they were never really, it's weird because like, they were never considered like Russian, you know, like they came because like the Russians were killing them, like in the pogroms.
Yeah, they were
Um,
fleeing Tsarist Russia.
Yes. And they settled in New York City,
Mhm.
and you know they lived in like I think a lot of Jewish, you know, they lived in the tenements, they lived in the Bronx, I think in Harlem too, a lot of
Mhm.
Jewish people
Mhm.
lived, so like the Jewish communities and the Black communities were kind of close together, I guess, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was, you know, there was, the Black community of where I grew up, though, everybody who was either Black or oppressed were generally thrown into the same neighborhood, and we were on the east side. And I grew up, part of my growing up, I should say, until I reached the age of 8. That's when we moved to another section of the city. But my next door neighbors were first generation Italians born in the country. And I was had three brothers, Frankie, Richard, and Dominic. And the last name was Dominic too, so he was being known as Dominic. But the grandparents were born in Italy. They could speak no English, but the mother at least was born in America. And this was in the 1940s, and she could speak English. The children, I never heard them speak Italian, but they could understand it. They all spoke English because they all went to school together. But there came a time when things would go better for the Italian families, and they would move out, and blacks would stay there. But that's how that went. That was the way it was going until I went into the army. But we had some strange relationships during that time. But there was a certain number of people who gravitated toward Black people. The Jewish young people and Italian young people. We especially, Black people, would influence culturally Italians, because Italians wanted to wear the same kind of suits that we did. They wanted to listen to the same kind of music. They wanted to walk like we did. And they wanted to use the kind of slang that we use. They were pretty good at it. But that was because they were poor. And that was because they were not really permitted to develop in the way that normal young white people developed. Because they had so many limitations on their families, and they were placed into impoverished situations which automatically would limit their potential. But those days are not here now. They might be psychologically to some, but they've been handled pretty well. Although now it's a lot of this immigration stuff has kind of recurred again, because a lot of the things that the current administration is talking about, they're not new. And I think that's what I'm trying to say. A lot of it isn't new. It's just a recapitulation of it. It's been revisited, so they're doing it again. And it takes all these people with all these buried, negative, horrible thoughts, gives them the opportunity now to vent what they want to do, to support something that sounds crazy to most of us, but absolutely credible to other people. But I want to continue now and talk about the Italian situation, if I might, just for a moment. Now, Italians were subject to a lot of what we would call vilification. You had three groups in America that challenged immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, that challenged immigrants of color, that challenged and sought to discourage Jewish immigration. These people represented the Know-Nothing Party. They were xenophobes. And all were inspired by the Ku Klux Klan. They were vehemently anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic. They're still anti-black and anti-Jew. The Catholic Church no longer, for whatever reason. But all of the violence and hypocrisy aside, let's just forget everything that I've said for the moment, but keep it back here. America has been uniquely blessed as a country by immigrationism for nearly 200 years. We can't forget that. This country has been made by immigrants. What looms crucial now is what I just said, a revisitation of, yeah, that's what we need. We need a revisitation by the same people who just 30 years ago, in the 1980s, ecumenists, academics, men and women of the street, to protest the barbarity of much of what is going on. We know what happened when good people began to zero in on apartheid in South Africa. They destroyed it. When good people began to, in the 1980s, 30 years ago, to zero in on the Nestle company's infant formula that was deforming babies at birth. We remember all that. Black civil rights. We remember the amalgamation of people who were good people, who refused to permit things that were just against the human spirit to exist anymore, both nationally and internationally. But that's gone. We don't have that anymore. We don't have on college campuses anymore young people rallying to defeat or to turn down something. Last thing, we had a feminist movement, but white women have gotten very, very comfortable with a few women being placed in positions of authority. White women, like black people, think now we got it made. Haven't. The system is still under the control, tight-fistedly, of those who do not wish to see this kind of movement continue. Be aware of that now. And nothing much has changed. If you go out there, chances are you're going to be a lone wolf for a while. I don't know. It was easy to pick up the phone. Hey, we're going to have a rally downtown at 2 o'clock. They'll be there. Whoever you call, they'll be there. Now you can't do that. You can't find it. Y'all packing up. What? Boy, last thing. When we come back, we're going to start looking at the historical consequences of the Great Migration.